work Livestream Fireside Chat today. As you know, because you're on this channel, Metis is an Ethereum Layer 2 scalable solution for DAO, DeFi, NFTs, and dApps, and also future platform for decentralized economy. I am Elena Sinelnikova, and today I have two special guests, and actually my personal friends as well, Lucia Gallardo and John Paller. So Lucia is a founder and CEO of Emerge and also Metis Advisor. So she is patenting the concept of impact as a service. Emerge, also her company pursues every new project with the goal of addressing one of or more of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It does so by harnessing the power of technologies such as blockchain and artificial intelligence. You can tell that I'm actually reading off my phone right now. I hate doing that, but yes, I know that Lucy is doing awesome things, that she is working for the social good projects. Her Emerge company has lots of them, and she will be telling about them in our live stream chat. And today is the future of work. So we're going to be talking about the workers' DAOs and the future of the workers. And John Paller is the founder and steward of Opolis and founder of my favorite hackathon event, It's Denver. And that's how we met many years ago now. So Opolis this is a digital employment collective that focusing on workers' right and protections. Opolis aims to radically transform individual workers' ability to survive and thrive in new economy. Metis strategic partner Opolis leverages the decentralized autonomous organization, which is, DAO, form of governance to accomplish that ambitious goal. Again, I'm reading off my screen. Sorry about that. I hate doing that, but just telling it in my own words, and that's why Metis is actually investing in Opolis. We believe in very much in the future of work. We believe in DAOs, and Metis is also a future platform. And today the topic is the future of work. The future of work, it refers to how the work gets done in the years to come. And Metis actually is the future platform for decentralized organizations, where you can create decentralized organizations, you can create your own company. And the front central purposes of Metis is to be able to accommodate people to create workers' DAOs. Which is decentralized entities that help them to have safe and fair work environment and communities. Actually, John has already done that. So he already created his own DAO. His company, Opolis, is done that. And today we're going to learn about this. So Lucia, John, you both doing a remarkable work in this area of the future of workers. What is your story? So you both are deeply immersed into blockchain space technology. So why future of work? Why future of workers? John, you first.
Sure. So in a previous life, before I took the red pill and went down the rabbit hole of blockchain, probably 2015. So I've been in the space for a long time. I actually was involved slightly in Bitcoin before that, but mostly just as a, sort of interesting thing. But in my previous life, I built a big staffing company. And that staffing company was one of the largest in the state of Colorado. And we W-2'd like 35,000 people over about 15 years. And I'm a student of economics, monetary policy, game theory, incentives, economic design structures, and living that life, see how imbalanced the commercial relationship of employment is. And after I kind of went down the rabbit hole, I had, you could call it an existential moral crisis of sorts, where I basically just said, this isn't sustainable. It's not, the term fair isn't probably my favorite way to describe it, but there's got to be a better way to create more mutualistic, relationships commercially to ultimately empower people to work from where, with whom, and how much they choose. So, it felt very forced, the life that I was living, and, exploitive in some ways. I mean, I have some very colorful metaphors that I would use to describe my previous life. But I won't share them today, just for brevity's sake. I'll just say that, like, it's been an evolution for me, and that's another big truck that just drove behind me. Good gosh. So I'll leave it there while it's being really loud, and I'll let Lucia take her turn.
Yes, Lucia. So please, your own story. Thank you, John.
Thanks. Well, my story is a little chaotic because it started when I was 8, before I even understood what the future of work meant. But it's very much that I grew up in a country with very, very high inequality rates. And not just inequality rates in terms of access, but also of opportunity, but also of basic services, income, etc. And that sort of determined this obsession that I have with understanding inequalities of any kind. And so I'm quite obsessed with this UN SDG that relates to decent work, economic growth, and opportunity. And similar to John, this notion of fairness, but perhaps I would use the term equitable, just like creating equitable conditions as it comes to work and employment. So I would say that, if we look at the state of work today, I would categorize it into like 3 different buckets. The first being opportunities, and unfortunately those are changing to both great and not great ways, and that about 50% of jobs have already responsibilities that can be automated, so the nature of work is changing, and people are losing their connection and trust that they'll be okay as soon as their workforce continues to change at an accelerated rate. So addressing the future of work means accounting for how opportunities in labor are going to change. The second bit in saying the environment itself, and I think John addresses it so well, is like, well, what does it mean to work? How do we account for a now predominantly remote workforce, global workforces? How do you manage these onboarding processes? How do you incentivize people to do certain things well at work? And how do you review them and analyze them when it's not a one-on-one meeting with your manager anymore, but rather, something at a distance that is less observable, and all of these ways in which the environment of work is changing. And the last part is this notion of governance, and how do employees really participate in ecosystems and structures and companies, and how do they get compensated? And as we look at these models of shared ownership, how do they actually participate in decision making? So the obsession with work is not just about creating work or understanding how to give people more work opportunities, but also this understanding of how the workforce itself is changing, and also how to sort of make sure that these opportunities carry a lot of dignity for people that are transforming the ways in which they generate income across the world. So my obsession is a very holistic thing in relation to work, and it's born from this obsession, a lifelong obsession that I've had with inequality and the ways that it manifests itself across a labor force.
Thank you, Lucia. Yes, I can hear you in inequality, and that's what blockchain is for. That's like how John said that he doesn't like the word fair, but I think that's what it is. It's fairness, and people. Yeah. So again, so you are talking about. I use the word fair because probably English is my second language. That's why for me it's like simple word, right? So everything else is too complicated. But yes, again, I agree. So maybe sometime it's too overused right now. So let us be equitable. So my next questions, we're going to be talking about DAOs a little bit more. So as opposed to majority leaders, probably John, you have been successful in influencing governors and governments about blockchain and DAOs. So can you please share how you convinced them that decentralized organization is not a threat to the government, but actually quite an opposite, how I see it? Were you successful in it? Because that's how I saw it.
Well, we've been incrementally successful. I think with any existing bureaucratic governmental system, it's a step change process. It's not one that's just going to happen. Like, they're not going to just like, oh yeah, we're just going to like all of a sudden like, yeah, it's not going to happen that way. The good news for us is, we happen to live in a part of the United States that's very in some ways libertarian, in other ways socially progressive. It's a weird mix. Often we get called, like, Colorado's called a purple state. Not really left, we're not really right. We're this weird sort of like, mix of viewpoints. And our governor didn't take any money from special interests. And so he, being the co-founder of Techstars, is very tech forward, very sort of progressive in how he thinks about, lots of different things. So, we have the good fortune of having sort of a social political climate that's at least open to the idea. So it took us probably about 3 years, even before Governor Polis came in. When Governor Hickenlooper was here, we started a blockchain council. There was exploratory stuff, a lot of educational things for legislators. I mean, just a whole bunch of stuff that we had to do to lay the groundwork for it. At ETH Denver 2020, there was a meeting that happened in what we call the Buffacorn Bluff, which is kind of the green room for some of our ultra VIP guests, where, we feed them beer and wine and they wait to speak or whatever they're doing. So we had some legislators from Wyoming, along with some, large influencers from the blockchain space, that we were talking about, legal frameworks and governance systems. And out of that conversation spawned the Wyoming DAO legislation. So admittedly, it's not perfect. There are some things that everybody knows needs to be adjusted over time. But it's a giant step in the right direction, in my opinion. It has the possibility still, as with almost anything that's highly bureaucratic and sort of like legislative in nature, that it could go the wrong direction as much as it could go the right direction. But we feel pretty good about where it's at. And, it's just been I think it's a combination of just, we happen to live in an area that's probably pretty open to this. And then it's just been a labor of love and just, somewhat masochistic persistence and just trying to be in front of as many people as we can constantly to sort of profess this, future of, the future of new commercial opportunities and organizing systems. And, as it relates to governments, providing, better access and services for their constituencies. So like, we've been beating that drum for a very long time, and we've you could call it a loose brick. The wall hadn't come down yet, so like we're not there, but and we're not also like being nefarious about it. We're not like trying to Trojan horse anything. Like, the people that we work with are very open to this now. So like there's even a whole digital transformation team in the state of Colorado that we set up a technology sandbox incubator to pilot this stuff. One of the pilots that we're doing is an employment DAO inside the state infrastructure. So like it's been a lot of work, but time, heat, and pressure is how you build diamonds, right? So like we've just been at it for a while.
Well, still, it is amazing. I think you had a huge leap, huge step towards it, because right now, majority of the blockchain startups, companies, even big ones, are struggling when the government's putting some, regulations upon them, and even, dissolving the companies. And I see that some companies doing decentralized just because of that, because they are so scared of it. So
where I suspect it's going to go is, you see companies like Shapeshift that are dissolving their entire organization, right? So they're moving to a DAO. And, there's a lot of questions around how do the, formerly known as employees relate to this DAO, and how do they contribute and be compensated, and how does governance happen? And I mean, there's just a ton there. But yeah, it's more and more happening. And I think the approach that we're taking is working, where we're not trying to skirt the regulations. We're trying to work with the existing tool sets and expectations, but then, really have a hand in advancing, to the next, epoch of whatever government looks like, right? And we've got some willing politicians that, from their point of view, from a game design incentive standpoint, which I always think about, their political careers are being advantageously affected because, you know, Wyoming and Colorado aren't New York and California, which are, you know, the largest states in the country, right? So, you know, we're not even Florida or Texas. We're sort of like third or fourth fiddle. So like, in order to differentiate, our governing bodies have a lot of incentives to actually experiment with innovation. So I think there's, again, a combination of factors that are really helpful for us, but we've tried to capitalize on them, but not in ways that are, you know, sort of YOLO-ish. I mean, we're taking a much more collaborative approach, because I do suspect that there's going to be the proverbial hammer that's going to come down on some of these organizations that just sort of thumb their nose at the governmental bodies. And we're trying to take a much more, like I said, incremental, progressive, collaborative approach, and sort of not force them to move, but not put ourselves in any sort of situation where they're like looking at us, pointing at us, going, "Oh, well, you did all these things." It's like, well, we did it, and we told you we were going to do it. Like, and they actually anointed us experimenting with this. So, like, you know, it's probably a slower approach when it comes to adoption, potentially, but I think the long view is what we care about most. And I think protecting our efforts from the kind of regulatory overreach stuff is pretty high priority, because even though the risk isn't like clear and present right now, it could easily become that way very fast, especially given comments like Gary Gensler's comments the other day. I don't know if you saw that, but he came out pretty aggressively talking about, you know, tokens and as securities and like all this different stuff. So like, yeah, we're very sensitive to it, and we feel like our approach is going to be the right one long term.
Awesome. So do you see any, I mean, any steps that government doing towards it? Like, do they see the use of it? Do they see the good in this, in the DAOs, in the decentralized?
I don't know that they understand it entirely yet. I think that it's still very early, even in the legislators' educational curve. I think some of them are more advanced than others. I think, you know, I've even spoken with certain legislators that like literally don't understand. You know that they don't understand it at all. I think we haven't quite seen the innovator's dilemma show up yet with the government, because they don't know what it entirely, like, they don't know the implications. I mean, at scale, in theory, if we're successful, the profile of government is going to be greatly diminished, because you'll basically disintermediate a lot of governmental bodies with technologies or DAOs or other sort of decentralized communities or tool sets that I don't think that they've contemplated that yet. I think there's still where enterprise technology was a couple of years ago, where they're like, oh, well, it's an efficiency tool, it's an optimization tool. I think that's the reality of it. I think there are some enlightened legislators that are very libertarian in nature, that like understand the sort of sovereignty of opt-in communities and how important that is to the future of government. And I think that that's very encouraging. So I think it depends on who you talk to, but I think the early signs are there that we're making good progress, and we have good reason to be optimistic.
Awesome. And I wish you good luck with it, because we follow your steps. So thank you for making that progress. I think that, yeah, everyone will follow your steps, seeing how you succeed in that. So Lucia, so you work on the projects and with the many institutions, and for example, with the United Nations. So how do they see this progress? What is their takes on you know, on the DAOs and the blockchain in a whole, in the decentralization as well?
I mean, I think the UN has moved in some ways surprisingly fast, and in some ways surprisingly slow. Like the nature of what they're sort of saying. I mean, you have very clear examples of organizations that have completely embraced decentralization. UNICEF being the primary example, the World Food Program being the other primary example of saying we can innovate via decentralization. And I think that's been really, really well executed. Obviously, there are some UN agencies, because we are talking about a very massive ecosystem that is largely autonomous, right? Like UNICEF operates separately than the World Food Program, than UNHCR, than the UN General Assembly. They all work very separately. And so I think the big question has sort of been, how much value are we showing that this technology has in these categories, right? And so the proof for education and future of work is clearly there, because the future of work is in fact changing. There are employment opportunities for working within blockchain and decentralization that is appealing to young people who make up the largest unemployed population in the world. So UNICEF, who cares very much about youth, is very keen on exploring this because they see this as an opportunity for boosting employment rates. Now, does the same count for the proofs in other areas that the UN works under? Not necessarily. And so that's where there might be a little bit more hesitation to move forward. I think the biggest questions that are asked on the regular, and I think it's a very, very valid question, is this notion of how is this designed, right? A DAO on paper and in theory might be a great idea, but if it's too complicated, you have low participation. If the incentives aren't aligned with the amount of work that needs to get done on behalf of the participants, then you have low participation and low motivation to actually get that work done. If it becomes a situation, that requires a lot of technical elements, it becomes very costly to both build and maintain. So there are all these questions of like, how is it that we are actually designing these ecosystems? And one of the things that, as a philosophy on the Emerge side has, been really meaningful to us is that a lot of the innovation that we see in the blockchain space starts very grand. The promise is we will revolutionize ID. We will transform the workplace. We will completely disrupt governance. And these very, very big promises constantly put us in a position where we fall short in execution. And one of the things about DAOs that's interesting to me, especially as it relates to workers, is this notion that there are components of governance and compensation and incentives and environments and opportunities that are small, and that giving this decision to the worker directly is actually value add. So an example of that is, there was a moment in time, and I don't know how far along this company is, but there was a moment in time where there was a service where essentially you could employ it into your company, and it related to insurance. So at the moment, the insurance plan is pretty standard for a lot of workers. It covers certain things. Now, I, for example, do not have 20/20 vision at all. So I prefer plans that obviously include a component of vision. However, my coworker might have 20/20 vision, and so a plan that emphasizes vision is very useless to this person, and they might prefer dental, or they might prefer a proactive health benefit, like, for example, covering the cost of a gym. And so I think, like, in this case, there was a moment in time, and I'm not sure where it's at right now in the decentralized industry, of saying we're going to give this decision over to workers so that they can decide which benefits they would like to include in their plan, and we're going to cover what it is that they deem a priority. And another example of that might be incentives for worker safety, or for certain things that are essentially low-hanging fruit, that the governance of which and the decision-making can actually be passed off to the employer at a feeling of, hey, I'm an employer that's included in the decision-making of this company and the way that it is governed. And so starting and building ecosystems and DAOs that focus on low-hanging fruit and smaller decisions that can help employers sort of see the value of employee participation, and then sort of build this use case and this proof of like scaling the degree and intensity of decisions that they're making within a workplace and moving upward from there. And if you think about building these micro networks, which I think is part of the reason why I'm so interested in Metis, is this notion of you're building simultaneous DAOs across board, and you're connecting them in a way. And so you're building, a mini DAO for these kinds of decisions in company 1, and then in company 2, and in company 3. And then a solution is coming together by which you're working directly with insurance companies to transform the way they design insurance programs. And so overall, I think the real value and incentive of going down this approach is demonstrating that smaller DAOs and use cases can actually bring the proof that we need in order to really go for these massive DAOs that are tackling very complicated problems around governance, because inherently, like, the DAO model, though inspired by a lot of power dynamics that have long been part of history, are still very much, new. And there are questions around how we design them and how we incentivize, compensate, encourage, et cetera, that need to be answered in practice. And theoretically, I think DAOs are amazing. In practice, I think we have a long way to go in delivering and executing a lot of the promises that very large companies are making. And I think the way to go about it is these like simultaneous smaller DAOs consistently creating DAOs and demonstrating that at small scale, they can take over the governance of certain decisions. And as we aggregate all of these DAOs together, we sort of see transformative governance from the ground up. I think that's really impactful. And that's sort of the way I approach talking about the potential of DAOs in a less intimidating way for people that are currently in charge of governing decisions that might view this as, you know, a very, very big behavioral change that they might not yet, as John has so helpfully pointed out, they don't understand yet for the most part.
So your approach would be then to create smaller, more simpler DAOs that focused only, like, for example, on one task, and make it more fluid, right? So the people can be members, not only one DAO, but like thousands of them across the board, right? So, but they are different tasks. Very interesting.
You're essentially building a puzzle, right? You're building a puzzle. You're saying this piece, you know, we get to decide how our company's health insurance plan is designed. We get to decide, you know, certain components of our workplace, and so suddenly you're building all of these like micro DAOs, and some employees might want to participate in all of them. Some employees might only want to, you know, their real big thing is compensation, or their real big thing is benefits, or, you know, and so they might decide to participate in one or the other. And over time, as you're sort of proving these puzzle pieces allow for, you know, more active employee participation, you're putting them all together. And what you have when you look at it from, you know, from above ground is you have a really participative, you know, company or whatever, you know, cooperative union, whatever it is that you want to do this as, but you have a really participative one. It's just people didn't even realize that they were doing it in all of these different little ways and exerting autonomy in all of these different ways. And so you're essentially proving that participative governance is strong and slowly putting these puzzle pieces together so that for, you know, over time, you have exactly the puzzle that you were looking for, which is a very, very strong DAO model. It's just that you did it in pieces and you did it slowly, and that change management impact, the change management over time is a lot easier for unions, companies, governments, et cetera, to handle, because they didn't get, you know, they didn't get thrown into the pool of like, now suddenly all the ways that we govern were bad and now we're good, and you know, we don't get how the tech works, and we don't get how incentives work, and we don't get how this is designed. And that's fair. Like, it's, you know, a lot of people don't get how it's designed. It's a newer thing. And so we have to be really patient. And the way to be patient is by proving in small scale. And I think that's a path that is much friendlier to securing the cooperation of larger entities for these kinds of projects.
Thank you. But you said the word fair. We agreed not to use it. But we already have started having some questions from the audience. We're going to be actually tackling them after I ask all my questions that I prepared. So my next question. In one of my conversations with the DAO maker, I was told by their CEO that decentralization cannot be the future, as only centralized businesses have sustainable business models. So that in essence, decentralized companies cannot exist because their business models cannot exist. So speaking about that, John, I know that Apolis works now. There is the commons, right? So it is a collective. So what, in addition to the obvious benefit of the social good, is there possible to make it sustainable and profitable in regards of the business model? And how do you do this?
So is this Chris you're talking about at DAO Maker?
That was not Chris. No, that was someone else. CEO.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually ran into them in Paris, but yeah. So I'll comment on that. I think I would not agree with that. I think that the way that we DAO right now is we just kind of ape into decentralization, and it's a total mess because there's no structure, there's no guidelines, there's no like, and then there's too many cooks in the kitchen and nothing ever gets done. So like I've seen this like rinse and repeat over and over and over again. So I'm a big advocate of progressive decentralization. And you know, when we built Opolis, we had two things in mind structurally. One is to build in a sustainably benevolent legal framework. and one that would not be exploitive at scale. So one that wouldn't diverge, you know, from advocating and benefiting its users at scale. So we had to have the legal protections and the governance protections to be able to guarantee that. And then the second one was to create an economically sustainable ecosystem. So, you know, when you look at the not-for-profit framework or the, you know, the sort of like, you know, public goods, open source world, you know, there aren't really good business models, and it's very difficult because the incentives are not there to create business models. Well, cooperatives have a long history of being very profitable. In fact, if you look at, you know, some of the most profitable companies in Europe or in South America, they're cooperatives. So, you know, they're a well-kept secret in Colorado. I mean, our legal framework is very flexible. You haven't seen the next epoch of what I call digital cooperatives really pop up yet. That's, I mean, what we're exploring, but I see no reason why cooperatives can't be profitable. You know, and cooperatives, in a lot of respects, to quote my friend Nathan Schneider, who's a professor at CU, you know, cooperatives were the first DAOs. You know, we just have new ways of, like, you know, managing them with respect to governance and economics. But, you know, they're really the same thing. So from Monopolist perspective, what we did is we have built into the services model a community sustainability fee. Now, based on cooperative law, at scale, when the community is profitable, our token is the unit of account to determine how much of those patronage profits go back to each member. So as a member of the cooperative, you have your tokens, and then let's say I've got 100 tokens and there's 1,000 tokens out there. Well, I'll get 10% of the profits. I'm being very simplistic just so to keep the math easy, but you know, what that also does from an economic engine standpoint is it incentivizes both the group and the individual to spur consumption, because now I have economic interest. It looks like equity, it operates like equity, but it's a different legal framework. It's actually called patronage in the cooperative law framework. So we've just tokenized and digitized patronage, which is the only activity in the US that is not considered a security that actually distributes profits back to an individual. And we did it such that, you know, we absolutely knew that if we took the not-for-profit or the foundation approach, where like you have no revenue stream, you have no business model, we're just going to be out with our tin cup and glasses like everybody else in a couple of years, right? And we're like, that's not good for the community's best interest long term. So we wanted the economic controls to be in the hands of the community, right? So the community is incentivized to build itself because doing so, and it's just it's frame. So I think thinking about DAOs in a very sort of like current phase, like how messy they've been, and you know, I think we're just really early. I think we haven't seen a lot of the sophistications that we're going to see. And when I say sophistications, I don't mean complicated. I mean, we're going to see better UX, easier participation, and we're going to see better business models combining to create. My prediction, you're going to see DAOs and digital networks that are worth trillions. So if that's not sustainable,
Awesome
I don't know what is.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yes,
Well,
I have the same. Yes, I have the same vision that it will be the future, and it will be profitable. It will be even more profitable than
more than we are now.
Companies.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going back
Absolutely.
to this question on design, right? How is this entire structure designed? Where is the model? I don't know how much, my favorite example to use, because I don't know how many people know this, but Juan Valdez is a Fortune 500 company. Juan Valdez is one of the largest coffee retailers in the world. It is actually a brand. It is not a company. The Juan Valdez project is a brand that represents all of the coffee cooperatives in Colombia. So if you are selling coffee from Colombia internationally, you are usually doing it under the banner, unless you're like a very small direct to to retailer, small farmer, you are selling under the banner of Juan Valdez, and Juan Valdez represents Colombian coffee to so many people in the world. And it is inherently a monetized version of bringing together all of these cooperatives, selling them under one brand, and then splitting the income equitably among them. And so it's a very great example of the ways in which there is absolutely potential to monetize this structure, this model. I think it's great that that's the example that you used. I completely agree with it. And Juan Valdez is like the best example we could use to illustrate that it can be highly profitable, and that it is inherently the way that you would design the DAO itself, as well as how it interacts with other DAOs, that really brings this opportunity for monetization forward. If it's not an active part of how you're thinking, then it's not going to be a present thing when you essentially build it, right? But if it is something that you have from the get-go, nonprofits can be perfectly self-sustainable. It's just that it has to be a monetization strategy that is powered through and intentionally built into the way that the NPO functions. So I think the real question is not, and this comment on, they don't have a place in the world is ridiculous, because I think the reality is there are people that are thinking through exactly how to monetize and make these strategies viable over the long term. It's just that it has to be an intention rather than the output of, on paper functioning like a nonprofit or like a traditional charity.
So I might just take slight exception to the, not-for-profits are sustainable generally, or they might be. In some cases, perhaps, but generally the game incentives and innovation incentives of not-for-profits are not terribly great. But I agree with the general pretext that, like, I guess what I would say to just dovetail is it seems like there's a lot of people in the DAO space that haven't really taken a hard look at history or real world use cases of other collective type of activities that have made successful scaling and sustainability of both economics and benevolence. Benevolence is debatable depending on the context of where you want to look. But yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think, quite frankly, my prediction is, if you look at history, we've used the vehicle of corporations to scale value predominantly. Mm-hmm. We're not going to be using that framework predominantly to scale value into the future. We're going to use a combination of DAOs, which is the technological side, and likely in lots of cases, we're going to use legal frameworks like co-ops, and we're going to pair them up. Mm-hmm. Now, in some cases, we'll just stay ethereal and they won't actually have any legal jurisdiction. They'll just be digital orgs entirely, but they'll still operate very much like they'll have business models like traditional co-ops, in my opinion. So I spent a long time studying this. I mean, it took us 3 years to build our business model, doing basically hardcore research on this. So I hold my opinions very loosely, but very passionately. So in any case,
John, at your the way that you would describe an NPO, I have a nonprofit foundation. It's been financially self-sustainable for many years now, and also was the first to incorporate blockchain in Central America. So I think that it really is, again, back to the way that you would design the actual charity. Like, there is room for designing organizations intentionally. And I think what you're bringing up about corporations is really interesting, because the essential worth of a corporation is, can you take a little bit of value creation and maximize the profit by which this little bit of value creation is generating, right? So how much can you really sell this one thing? Whereas I think in the newer model, and when we're talking about the future of work, to dovetail off what you're saying, is this notion of constant value creation and how that can be continuously democratized. It's an entirely different model. And I think that the change in amount of value created, which is the part that is incentivized through structures that are decentralized, is the one that is really eye-catching, and the one that, to me, has a lot of potential for deep monetization, because it's not a little bit of value under a core value proposition that is trying to be sold more, but rather, how do we consistently create value, all of which is monetized? It's an attitude change, it's a behavior change, it's a design change, and it's very much, I agree with you that it is very much the way forward in terms of the way that we would organize, work, and also value and income and profit.
My questions that I prepared probably right now will be less interesting than what our audience is asking. So one of our audience members asking, my question, looking at the current framework of traditional corporations, will be easily to incorporate DAO models. And I also add to it, if the DAO is actually international, right? So it's across the borders, right? So there are members from different countries. So how do you see that? How to incorporate? Where to incorporate? What is going to be the future of it? Like your vision of it?
John is braver than I on this point because he's going after the regulated part. I'm going after low-hanging fruit that doesn't require that much regulation so that I can proof it out. And I think that's the on my end, I think that's really where we see businesses and governments being a little bit friendlier in considering DAO models, is like essentially saying, here is something that can demonstrate the potential, but that won't impact your power or decision-making strategy in a really, really meaningful, aggressive way right now. And our process has been mostly in that realm. And we've done work in the public sector and in the private sector under this model, specifically because we're saying, you don't understand DAOs, that's fine. We'll show you in small micro ways. And I think, John, I'm going to steal this phrase forever of like progressive decentralization and saying, we're going to start with this low hanging fruit and then show you upward how we can scale this into a strategy. And I think that has fared well for us. But I think I'm so curious to hear John's answer because he started in a different place and I think it's a lot braver.
It might be more masochistic, actually. But I'll let you use the word brave, sure. I think it depends. I think one of the knee-jerk things that people do in doing a startup is they assume they need to incorporate. Mm-hmm. And, it's just like, we see this all the time where it's like when people hire people, part of the whole point of Opolis is to not have to hire people. You can create a mutualistic corp-to-corp relationship with your contributors, and all the compliance is taken care of. So like people just think they need to figure out HR and benefits and all this. It's like, well, do you really need to? Or even should you? And they don't ask those questions. So I think incorporation is one of those things where people just assume they need to do it. I think it all entirely depends. First off, like I would ask the first question is, should we even consider incorporation? And I wouldn't necessarily just listen to your accountants and your attorneys. I'm not advocating not paying taxes. I'm not advocating any of that. I'm just saying that like having an ethereal organization, I don't think is out of the question when it comes to like where things are going to go. I could think of several situations where basically the contributors to DAOs will bear the responsibility for paying taxes and being compliant, but the actual orgs themselves may not have a jurisdiction. I mean, how would you argue that? Like if you have literally one person from 185 countries in a DAO, like which country is going to get jurisdiction? How do you even decide that? Like, that's a very interesting legal question. So, the appropriateness of incorporation is the first question. The second question is, if you're going to incorporate, or if you determine that you need to for some particular reason, I would say you have to evaluate the laws of the places that you're going to want to incorporate. And that takes a little research, and you need to do a little bit more thinking than just listening to attorneys. Attorneys they always seemingly have, sort of agendas, sometimes just protecting their own butts. You have to think about risk management and, liability, et cetera, et cetera. One of the reasons why I'm absolutely in love with the cooperative legal framework in Colorado is because it's so darn flexible, and you can define your classes and patronage and all in governance however you want. So, you can basically make a DAO out of it, and you can have an EIN number, and your members don't have operating liability as you would with an LLC or something like that. So they still get patronage and rights to profits. So, and it comes with a securities exemption. How many people know that, right? So there's a lot of things that you can find that, whether it's the DAO legislation as it matures in Wyoming or other states that get into the mix, or it's a cooperative. I mean, I'm only talking about US right now. There could also be, Gibraltar or Malta or Estonia, or other very blockchain friendly jurisdictions that come up with incorporation strategies. Unfortunately, the US has a mind of its own a lot of times, where it sort of looks through all that stuff to see like what you're doing. Which is why we always advocate, like, you know, doing things above board. I mean, obviously I live in the United States, so for me, it's a clear thing that I have to deal with. I don't live somewhere else. One of the other favorable things about US laws, in most cases, foreign entities and individuals can become members of LLCs and cooperatives. So you don't even have to be a US citizen to be a member of a US cooperative. That's cool. And there's no securities requirements or KYC requirements around that. So it's, you know, it all depends on the use case. So like if you decide you need to incorporate, then I would look at like, there's probably about a dozen variables that you're going to want to unpack and look at and make smart decisions. I mean, there's really good counsel and cooperative law they're actually getting into. We're helping them getting into the DAO side of things. We've got other attorneys that we've worked with that just, you know, consider, you know, risk management and things. So like, again, there's lots of opportunities to like evaluate what decisions you should make, but I certainly wouldn't make them lightly. That's the other thing that I would do. You got to think long-term about risks and sustainability, and, you know, compliance is a thing. If you're going to incorporate, you have to understand what you're signing up for, and you have to be compliant if you're going to do that. You have a little bit more creative license if you're going to just stay ethereal, because then as long as the individual contributors are paying taxes and staying above board and doing the things that they need to do in the jurisdictions that they're in, then there's not a lot to worry about, in my opinion. I mean, who are they going to go after if you have a completely decentralized organization? I don't know. It seems like it would be very difficult for them to do that.
Well, sometimes they go and they punish the user, right? And that's
they're always going to go after the contributor. The easiest way. So what's going to happen? My prediction, and this is just sage advice. If anybody listening wants to take this, if you're going to contribute to DAOs, make sure you're paying your taxes on what you receive. Make sure you're reporting it, and make sure that you do it above board. Why? Because when the ABC, you know, the alphabet soup regulators come around, it's going to be really hard for them, as I said, to go after the DAOs. Like, where is it even there's no incorporation. There's no thing. Like, what do they go after? Code? No, they're going to go after the contributors. Okay. So if you don't have your ducks in a row, what do you think they're going to do? Just like they do everybody else, they go after taxes. That's what they do. And they'll say, you participated in tax evasion. You didn't pay tax. And they'll throw the book at you, and that's how they'll make an example. So I think DAOs have a really delicate path forward in some ways, because I think, for me at least, thumbing your nose at the authorities is a really good way for somebody to be made example of. And I'm just not interested in that. You know, I'm, you know, as I've illustrated previously, I'm trying to take the approach of like collaboration versus, you know, just, you know, it's a longer approach probably, but, you know, it is what it is.
I mean, I think the other bit here is this notion of finding exceptions and sandboxes, right? So if you find a jurisdiction, you know, similar to something like Bermuda might offer, which is, you know, we don't understand how DAOs are going to change the future of regulation. So one of the ways that we've experimented a fair bit has been, okay, well, you don't understand it, but how about your regulators observe, you know, our behavior and sort of let us operate here at limited regulation and restriction, observe it, and sort of we can even work with you to preemptively design some of the regulation. And so at that point, it becomes a much friendlier environment. You won't be the example they make, you know, they make heads or tails out of, because you are very open about the ways in which you're going to be inviting them to participate, and then leverage the infrastructure lack of regulation that is in that particular jurisdiction because they've allowed for that. And so sandboxing, I've found, is a really interesting way to sort of skirt certain more delicate pieces of it. But I absolutely agree that that it is like extremely encouraged to do things above board as much as possible, even, you know, inviting people to observe, participate, et cetera, to see how it's going to impact the future of regulation. The other bit is like being very mindful that just because we define things in certain ways they may look like other things, and that might affect how regulators approach things. And I think the NFT space has been the example made here, which is, essentially it sounds like an asset, but unless it is in a truly decentralized platform, then it looks like a security. And so, NBA Top Shots is probably the best example of that, because it sells like an asset, but in fact, a lot of people are considering regulating that like a security, because essentially it's dependent on the protocol, and liquidity is dependent on the protocol. So making sure that we're paying attention to what we're saying it is, but what it might look like to particularly aggressive regulators might also be a consideration that I would advocate you pay very close attention to, just to be a little bit proactive and prevent any aftermath of lawsuits and eyes and very complicated situations that unfortunately a fair bit of people in our space have gotten into.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yes, we're going to see a lot of new things that like this, right? So lots of unknowns, and yeah, and we're going to explore it together as we create different DAOs. So we're going to see how this will unfold. Before that, we cannot even know, right? So, but it's certainly very important to think about it ahead of time still. We actually coming close to the end now. So I also wanted to ask you, because now you already started this, you started the worker DAO, so you see already the first results. What are the first results that you get? What are the feedback? What are any success stories? Anyone that this DAOs and this decentralized organization already helped you? Can you please share that?
John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, I can go. Well, I think our patience and time and attention to detail is paid off in some ways. I mean, we sort of took the tortoise approach. We thought about tokenizing back in 2017, and I'm really super glad that we didn't. We didn't actually have the regulatory or just compliance understanding of how to do this in a way that was actually going to be, sustainable. From a user standpoint, we've been able to deliver on the value propositions and that we've promised. And, the thing that I'm most happy about is that we've been able to do that with, concrete belief that we will have a sustainably benevolent ecosystem toward our members, which of course was largely spawned out of like the legal research and the governance design and like all of these things that took a very long time to do. So yeah, I mean, we now have, a large constituency of our members are DAO members. Like these are people that work ethereally. They work with organizations that they're either foreign or they don't have legal entities somewhere. In some cases, they're getting paid in a combination of stables and ecosystem tokens, and they got to pay their rent, so we're able to provide them, as I mentioned previously, this legitimacy, this like compliance, staying above board, the normalcy, if you will, of traditional employment. We're basically replicating the experience of traditional employment without them having to give their independence up or to subjugate themselves to some larger corporation. So the cake and eat it too strategies worked. We're now just scaling it. The goal is to get to thousands, if not tens of thousands, or even potentially millions of members. We have a lot of work to do in, evolving the product and just adding features and, making it even more user-friendly than it already is. But, it's so far it's gone pretty well. I mean, we can't complain. I mean, we don't have, I think in almost a year of being live, we've had one member leave. One. So like from a user or customer perspective, because we don't call them customers because they're owners, right? They're members. They're part of they're part of the co-op, right? So as a member of the co-op, they're an owner. We don't see people leave because again, we've been able to deliver on the value prop that we set out, and we have a no bullshit, no sales approach there's nothing to sell. Like it either fits who you are or it doesn't. It's more of a values thing and a life situation thing than it is a sales process, which is great because it's easy to like, for those that are in the right mindset in situations, they're drawn to it. So, and I think this is, this, part of the purpose economy or sort of the creator economy, whichever economy you prefer. I think this is going to be largely the way that people connect with products and services that they need is going to be based on how it connects to their personal lives. It's not really going to be a sales process in the future. So that's where we are. We're doing great so far, and we're excited to see where it goes next.
Congratulations on the success. Yes. So, and if you we right now we're live streaming this. So if you are interested in joining apolis.co, so this is the link that you should go and check it out. So, and Lucia.
In our case, I think because we focus on a lot of like in different environments, we focus a lot on communities that don't have a lot of technological infrastructure, that don't have high technological literacy rates and things like that. A lot of the successes on our side has been participation and also how to structure within different cultural contexts. And I think that's been really the major win, has been, highlighting these kinds of cases in, for example, within an Indigenous community and building a community fund that is essentially every member of the community gets to vote on how those funds are used. So, they produce as an Indigenous community a very great product, which sells out every year. We were able to, do some traceability work to validate the quality of the product and the origin of the product, which is made from a plant that has been in existence and protected for 150 years in a 150-year-old Indigenous tradition. So adding layers of trust in the quality of the product, justifying a price increase, and then using that increase to fund a community improvement fund where they get to vote on, how these funds are going to be used, what they're going to go toward, and what they're going to invest within their own community, has been really successful. And it's been built and modeled off existing frameworks of collaboration, which I think, both John and I have tried to highlight over and over again, is that there are great examples of how this is at work. And so by modeling a lot of the technology functions and designing the ways that we build and design these solutions around those existing frameworks allows us for better adoption. And so on the farmer side as well, a big piece of this has been, to what extent can we then use this DAO infrastructure to validate certain things where they've self-organized already. And this is something that probably an assumption that we constantly have to combat, which is when people are designing tech solutions and they sort of bring the design with them to implement. And one of the things that we've, learned throughout our experience forever has been this notion that like there is already self-organization in a lot of the spaces where we're trying to inject DAOs. So taking that self-organization and digitalizing it and decentralizing it in a technological method is really the way to go. So the lessons that we've learned and the ability to garner support from government ministries and from international venture funds and from institutions that are observing these pilots and these projects has been this notion of we already use self-organized existing models of governance that are conducive to decentralization, and we add the value that the technology can bring, and then we add the incentives that this technology brings. But human behavior is by nature socially collective. So essentially what we're doing by designing governance protocols and governance digital communities and things like this, including DAOs, is this notion that we are just digitizing social behavior that is innate within us. And so the lessons that we've learned in our implementations that I would call successful has been how to do this in cases where we're talking about a different league of technological connectivity. We're talking about Indigenous communities that didn't use tech before or that are now starting to use specific kinds of tech, or with farmers that are in super rural areas within different parts of the world. So an understanding of the human behavior component of this has been the largest success for us to date, which is why our solutions are actually scaling as well. And I think we credit it to this understanding of social collective behavior and this perspective of being a socio-technological solutions creator rather than, with the intention of just building the technology.
Thank you, Lucia. And thank you so much, John. Thank you, Lucia, for this chat. So if you would like to check out their work, so for Lucia, it's emergetechlab.com. This is Elena Sinelnikova, Metis, and I also CryptoChicks co-founder as well. And we will see you very soon. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.